All right, let's dive into an idea that might just change how you see, well, everything. We're going to look at what happens if the Bible's most famous act of creation wasn't about making light at all, but about revealing something that was already eternal. You'll see how this one little shift could potentially connect Genesis, theology, and the fundamental laws of physics. Right from the very first page of the Bible, there's a phrase that is so iconic, so foundational, it has literally shaped our understanding of creation for thousands of years. Let there be light. We've all heard it. We've always pictured it as the moment God created light out of pure nothingness. It's like the starting pistol for the entire universe. But what if we've been reading that wrong this whole time? What if this wasn't an act of manufacturing something new, but an act of, well, manifestation? That is the provocative question at the very heart of the material we're digging into today.
So how on earth do we get to an idea like that? Well, the whole argument really hinges on rereading one specific verse, not as poetry, but as a literal statement of fact. The verse is 1 John 1:5. God is light. Now, the author of our source material argues that we've always read this poetically, like a beautiful metaphor. But they're suggesting we should be reading it literally. This is what the source calls an ontological claim. And ontology is just a fancy word for the study of what something is at its absolute core. So the argument isn't that God is like light. It's that the very substance of God's being is light. Think about it like this. When the Bible says, God is my rock, that's obviously a metaphor, right? We know God isn't a literal stone. But the source argues that God is light is different. It's not a comparison. It's a fundamental definition about the actual fabric of reality. And this is where the argument takes a really fascinating turn, because it tries to connect this theological idea directly to the laws of physics. So the whole thing leans on a cornerstone of physics, the first law of thermodynamics. It basically states that energy can't be created or destroyed. It can only be transformed. In other words, the total amount of energy in the universe is, and always has been, constant. This slide just lays out the logical chain perfectly. So, if God is light, and we know from physics that light is energy, then that first law of thermodynamics leads to a pretty stunning conclusion. Light cannot be created. It must be eternal. And this just brilliantly illustrates the core shift in thinking. If light is eternal, then the event in Genesis wasn't an act of creation. It was an act of expression. It was the eternal revealing itself within a brand new system. So, if light is eternal, what does that do to our understanding of Genesis? Well, it kind of changes everything. The traditional view is that God created light from absolute nothingness. But in this new framework, let there be light is more like God expressing his own eternal nature into our time-bound reality. It's the moment the eternal says, let my being be manifested here. This framework also reframes some really complex theological terms. For instance, when Christ is called the firstborn of all creation, the meaning shifts from being the first thing made to being the first expression of the eternal God within our reality. Okay, now the theory takes its most ambitious step. It maps this entire concept onto the most famous equation in all of physics, E equals mc squared. The proposal here is pretty radical. It suggests that all this complex mathematics isn't some external rulebook that God has to follow. Instead, the laws of physics are the consistent, predictable expression of his own nature. They're like God's fingerprints all over reality. This table lays out the mapping, and it's fascinating. The source connects these ancient scriptural terms to modern physics. So the spirit, ruach in Hebrew, which means animating force, is linked to energy, E. The word, davar, meaning substance, is linked to matter, M. And God the Father, who the source identifies as light, is the constant, C squared, that unifies them both. Of course, an idea this big is bound to face some challenges. So how does this framework hold up against some of the major objections from both science and theology? The first one is a big one: black holes. I mean, if God is light and black holes are famous for trapping and destroying light, what does that imply? Well, according to the source, black holes don't actually destroy light, which would violate the laws of physics. Instead, they warp space-time so intensely that the path of light just curves back on itself. The light is still there.
It's still following its own rules, just in a ridiculously extreme situation. Okay, the second big challenge comes from the second law of thermodynamics, entropy. You know, the tendency for all systems to move toward disorder and decay over time. So, if God is light, is God subject to decay? The answer here comes straight from Einstein's theory of relativity. You see, entropy, decay, is a process that requires time to pass. But for a particle of light traveling at light speed, time itself literally stops. From the photon's perspective, no time passes at all. And if there's no time, there's no decay. Light is timeless.
And what about miracles? This framework suggests they aren't God breaking his own rules. Far from it. Instead, they are higher-order expressions of those very rules. So Jesus walking on water isn't physics being violated, it's physics obeying its ultimate author. So we end with this final thought. This entire framework is asking us to consider a monumental shift. What if the universe isn't some separate object made from God, but a continuous, structured expression of the One, whose very being is and always has been light?